All
Okay.
right.
So I guess we'll get started. Welcome, everybody. My name is Sean Wu, and I'm on the education committee for Flatirons Young Farmers Coalition. And tonight with us, we have Rich Pecoraro with MASA Seed Foundation, and also Nanna Meyer and Dan Hobbs with Hobbs and Meyer Farms. So we're going to start off with Rich, and he'll talk for about 35 minutes. And then Dan and Nanna will also talk for another 35 minutes, and then we'll have some time for question and answers. And then just a quick wrap up. So thank you for showing up today. So Rich, in 1990, Rich Pecoraro helped facilitate the launching of the nation's first 100% organic non-hybrid seed company, Seeds of Change. He served as co-director of seed production, post-harvest handling, and co-authored detailed crop information for 5 years until branching off to engage a new agricultural-related enterprise called Abundaza, a regional seeds and produce organization from 1996 to 2015. At their peak, they cultivated 50 acres, providing 400 CSA members with seasonal vegetables while selling their locally adapted seeds and produce at the Boulder Farmers Market and new trending restaurants. The mission to provide organically grown produce from their own regionally adapted seeds. The goal is to build out a unified understanding of agricultural and horticultural history to facilitate progressive transformation and provide alternative solutions to our modern food system. The vision is to create a network of social unity and food sovereignty for urban, suburban, and rural people of the Front Range. And with that, I will let Rich talk about dry beans. Go for it, Rich.
I'm going for it. Okay, 35 minutes and counting. Hi, everyone. Thanks for that introduction, Sean. That was great. I don't have to say a lot more. That's a mouthful. I think in my history, though, I was drawn to seeds at a very early age and introduced to diversity, plant origins, and staple crops, as well as somewhat exotic crops, medicinal herbs and such, all right from the get-go back in the early 80s during the early movement of Save the Heirlooms and the resurgence of open pollinated seed varieties back into the system. And so it took me 30 to almost 40 years before we were able to finally create a nonprofit that's just around straight seed foundation work and being able to do regional adaptation work and hopefully develop a local co-op and actually do this long-term, very, very important work, adapting species, adapting varieties, and starting to bring these plants back home into a farming community. Having it really mean something to carry seeds from generation to generation again. I think it's a big challenge, and it's just as much the lost art as actually growing it, is just acknowledging that it's good to stick with the variety that works, that you can work with yourself and you can pick and choose and do your selection work, and not to be lured always by something new and groovy and cool. There's a lot to be said with sticking with, what does well after a lot of trialing. So I'm here to talk about dry beans. Hi, everyone, dry beans. This is a very big subject. I recognize that I'm speaking with a wide group of people who have some years in cultivation of the crops and others who are brand new. And please excuse me that I'm speaking to a screen. It's really weird. Hi. I love speaking to people in a classroom or in the field or in the greenhouse or in the seed room. And Sean knows because I've been there with her before. But I'll do my best. So dry beans, we have to consider that interest is a big thing, right? For those who have never grown them, even for those who are growing them, our interest is going to drive our inspiration to take a shot at doing this if we're going to do it at any scale. Gardening the bean is different than farming the bean, because the bean can become, which is so many types, the legumes can become something that can integrate into both a very monocultured field and a very diversely planted field as well. They have the wild nature to integrate with grass grains and with other species. So and in some cases, it's even beneficial to some of our beans to have other species nearby. In most cases, still we're working with, I don't want to call it monoculture, but we are working with, say, blocks of certain varieties where you just, you plant them out and that's all there is. So let's just start. I'm going to break it down into two things. I have to talk fast because there really is a lot to cover and we don't have that much time. Cool season legumes. Now we're talking about dry beans. The recent resurgence in pea protein is one thing, which means field peas. Peas, a lot of the peas that are being grown for pea protein right now are a combination field pea mixed with somewhat like a snow or a sugar pea. They're not just a pure field pea like a rock solid field pea. They do have a little bit more starches in them, and so they can be used more in gruels, and then they could be used in mashes. And oftentimes it's a yellow pea, and most of those varieties right now are actually patented, by the way, already, or they're really difficult to find. So we haven't even begun to research that particular genre, but I think it's really interesting. And we do have some yellow field peas that we're going to try. But that said, field peas in general is a viable dry bean. And it falls in this time of year planting. And one would have wanted to already have them planted by now to take advantage of all this snow and rain. With the peas is chickpeas as well, lentils, and fava beans. Now, all four of these fall into, your cool season legumes. They all produce dry bean crops, and they're all very, very interesting to grow. And they all have a particular nature about them, but they all are very closely related, even tribally, in the family of the Leguminaceae or the Fabaceae. So, and they're all really, really old cultivars from like Neolithic crops. So we've experimented with all of them. And right now we are growing peas, favas, Vicia fava, and Caesariatinums, which are your garbanzo or chickpea. We have a black and we have a tan type. And we're also growing lentils, which you have two types, and both of them are ones we've been carrying. We haven't diversified into the multicolors and some of the really tinier ones that are being grown up north in Montana. These are really good, viable options to start to try to grow for people, to learn the nature of how they grow, even in a garden scale and in a field scale. Couple of things that's really beneficial with these crops: very high protein, very little disease pressure in most cases, cold tolerance, so you can take advantage of spring moisture. So these are really key factors. Early harvest, which gives you plenty of time to work with drying, curing, and such. And at the end, decent yields. And one of the other things that these crops provide is an intercropping experimentation that is, it's really viable. For instance, peas and oats, peas and grains can be grown together actually, but the populations have to be moderated so that you're growing peas more heavily than your grass grain, so that the grass grain can act somewhat as a trellising. They can be harvested together, combined together if they dry properly, and separated in screen cleaning. Not always is it's the best case, but it can be experimented with. There's several types of peas. You have bush peas, you have vining peas, and then you have hyper tress peas that really can grab on and they self-trellis themselves. And so there's peas in general is a big world, and it can really be a very interesting one to get good at, because for one, pea seed's very valuable in the seed industry. If you become a good seed grower of peas, the value of the seed for peas is probably higher than any of the food values of any of the beans. It is not a crop that's widely grown here anymore, only because we do deal with issues such as powdery mildew when we get wet summers. So you're dealing with a lot of variation in all these crops, but they grow well. They take advantage of our cool soils. We can get a good crop. It is a possible crop. I wouldn't steer somebody away from growing them. I think they're well worth experimenting with. Things like fava. Now, a fava will grow a good food crop, but very rarely will it give us a good bean crop and a seed bean crop. And one of the reasons why is it's such a large bean. And our temperature, the fluctuations in our temperatures are so great when it goes into flower and it goes into bean set, that we end up getting a lot. And then when we get overhead rains and the temperatures cool after rains, we get a lot of rotten fungus on our seed pods, and it usually works into the bean seed as well. And so there's a lot of work that needs to be done on the fava bean to get good seed crops. So I'm just going to stop there on fava. Great crop to grow, really worth experimenting with, but mostly used as a fresh bean crop. Let me jump to garbanzo really quickly, or chickpea. Now, chickpeas are very dependable. They're easy to sow. Just high density. You can plant them as close, usually beans are planted, a couple inches apart in the row anyway, but even your row spacing can even be as close as 8 inches. They can be drilled in a grain drill, or they can be spread out and become broader plants, just as like lentils can, and some field peas. So you get this mass population that can also suppress weeds pretty well. And they can put up with cold temps, and they're cool temperature germinators. And they can handle heat really well, so they are drought tolerant, although they do like a little bit of irrigation. They also can be intercropped on a row, every other row stagger with a grain. So one can sow, say, oats or heritage wheats or a barley or any one of those. Rise a little bit too aggressive. Spread out a foot apart, and then you can you can run a row of those kind of the garbanzo in between, and they will make a crop. It'll shade them a little bit. You're not going to get in there to weed that easily because your population is going to be pretty dense, but it can be somewhat, for those who really like the wild planting feeling, it's worth experimentation. And you'll be able to separate the crops out by doing dual screen sizes at the end. And both crops will mature at the same time. Lentils can be that way also. All these crops make full maturity here. Issues with lentils, like with peas, is peas lodge, and so they lay over on the ground. And lentils are they're a short plant. They only get about a foot, 14, 16 inches at max. They get very top heavy. They're really mostly foliage with very small lenses that are, pods, and yet they weigh up, and then a good hard rain will smash them into the ground. Doesn't sound too enticing, right? Well, they are a desert crop, but they're grown commercially in Montana, and they do get rains in Montana, northern, a lot of eastern Washington where it does dry out, and eastern Oregon as well. Now we do get crops of them, and the main issue is lodging. So right now we're in experimentation again to do a every other row sequence with them, and this year we did it with a Durham wheat, an Iraqi Durham wheat, which you're going to hear a little bit more about from our colleagues coming up. So all those crops are really worth a look. Their yields are, in good yields, garbanzos can match the yields of a good dry bean that we're going to go into as the main summer crop beans. The lentils are a little bit lower, and it really depends on population. And peas, like I said, are very worth trying to grow. And taking it to seed, you learn a lot about cool season beans, maturation, powdery mildew, how to really handle it, because they were grown here. Traditionally, they were grown here, but they did move to Idaho and north because the summers were a little bit drier. And that's really the only reason, believe it or not, a little bit drier. So that's our main issue here. And you will find as we move into what we'll call the warm season beans, not the hot season yet, because the hot seasons, or the long hot season beans, is our primary issue is when we get cool summers. It slows down the production of beans for dry beans, and maturation can take us all the way to the end of the season when we start to get cold temperatures, and that's when powdery mildew sets in. So we'll move into warm season beans, and let me look at my time. I'm about 20 minutes in or 15 in now. That looks about right. Okay. So I've got another 15. Is that right, Sean? Hello. Hi. Is anybody speaking? Hi, can you hear me? Can Sean hear me?
Sorry.
Yeah, you got 15 minutes left.
Oh, look at all you dudes. Okay, it's good to see your faces. Hi. All right, hi. Hey,
Thanks,
man.
Austin.
Right on, thanks. I just wanted to ask you, I have about 15 minutes to go. Yeah, just to get to 6:30. I just want to check my timing. So the main season beans that are primarily grown here are from the genus species Phaseolus vulgaris. So that's all your common snap beans and all your primary dry beans that we know, such as black beans and pinto beans obviously fall in that, navy beans fall in that. And then the plethora, it's an ubiquitous list of dry beans from Mexico and all over really the temperate zone that are of the Phaseolus vulgaris genus species, and those varieties are all eligible here. One of the things that I stated before with the cool season beans, and this is really important to carry through when anybody thinks about bean culture here on the Front Range, is, again, cool, wet. Hot's fine, cool, wet, no good, right? But we can't control that. The best we can do is we can trial varieties and work with varieties that show the ability to do all the things we want them to do, right? So the primary things we want the beans to do, we want fast emergence, which means we have to plant them when the soil warms up. For those who haven't planted beans, we're going back to bean 101. We have to wait for a warm season bean. We have to wait for those soil temperatures to get up there. It's generally better to wait on beans, not to rush dry beans in the middle of May. If you plant in the beginning of June, as we warm up, you will have plenty of time for maturation. The germination will be far better and quicker. And that means you'll have easier time controlling weeds, and you'll have a better stand. When beans get into cold soils, they're slower to emerge, and you can already invite viruses and fungal stuff, and that's the stuff you want to try to stay away from. Snap beans, even worse, just because they're even more tender and they don't have the ability to withstand. The seeds don't have the carbohydrates to hold. They're thin, they're small, and they're softer, so they rot. So you want to wait for your temperatures to get up to a nice time post Memorial Day, waxing moon, get them in the ground, good dense populations. Most of these Phaseolus vulgaris varieties, and this is bush beans only, not pole beans. Bush beans, the closest you can put bush beans in rows and get away with is about 24 inches. If you get any closer, they're really going to fall all over each other. A single row of bush beans, dry beans, even likes it as wide as 30 inches and even up to 36 inches. Believe it or not. They need the airflow. It's really, really important they get airflow, because later on in their growth period, they are going to fall all over each other. And like I said, and I'll keep saying it, a good solid summer monsoon, late July, early mid-August, especially like a mid-August monsoon can be, and it happens, right? So fall into each other, too close, originally too close, so too much foliage and all that. So spacing's really, really important with the vulgaris varieties. They really need the airflow and the room, which, so 30 inches about right, 24 the very closest. Variety specifics. Short and stouts are the best. Again, because less lodging, right? Lodging, falling over. Short and stout, the best varieties are, the Pinto is a great variety. That's why they grew a lot of Pintos here. The black bean has always been really successful here. We have a Hopi black bean that we've been growing a Hopi black since the early 90s in New Mexico. We do it here. Fantastic maturation. The beans are upright. They all mature. They don't lodge hardly at all. Easy to hand harvest, even decent enough to cut and combine. Crops that you can work with. We have a red bean that's the size of a Pinto that comes out of Mexico. That's also very upright bean, really easy to work with. High yields. Your yields in general, because we're throwing all this out as fast as we can here. Your yields you're looking at on the low end, 1,500 to the high end, 3,000 pounds, on an acre. So you can start to look at those numbers as possible. And with intercropping, you may get less, but you'll also get a second crop. We can talk about that in a minute. So on those beans, and again, even back to the cool season beans, garbanzos, short and squat, don't lodge. Beans set nice, solid up into the plants, dry completely, easy to harvest. Those are really good features to have when it comes down to the end, when you really got to get the crop. Things like lentils and peas are difficult because they are trellis dependent a lot of times. So you either intercropping with grains or doing trellises to grow pea seed, which is very worth it. It can actually be worth your time. We're doing it this year on an acre. We're trellising an acre of pea seed this year because we want pea seeds. Let me step back for just a second, and fertilization and irrigation are both really important parts. The cool season crops can go both ways. They can either be, all three forms of irrigation can be used: drip, overhead if it's done properly, and flood irrigation. Most people these days prefer drip irrigation for a lot of things, but if you get into acreage, the way it's done is flood irrigation. And so there's technique in all on how to grow, beans and legumes under those conditions. And that's usually planting flat, waiting for a weed set to come up. There's tools, there's primary cultivation tools that are used and still used And two of them right now are the lily weeders, which are a tine weeder that goes over a germinated legume at about so tall, and it literally will rip out a few of the legumes as it scratches all the little weeds, and then you get a first weed set clean. That's a very valuable tool. The tried and true one that's been around forever is called a rotary hoe, and it has many, many, many wheels with spikes in it, and you literally at very high speeds, like as high a speed as a tractor will go, zipped over a field, driven right over the crop. Again, it'll knock out a few sprouts, but it takes out 75 to 90% of those first weeds. This is how the commercial farmers do it. Oftentimes, they'll even go over a field pre-emergent and just try to knock out a set. Weeds are an issue. Later on, those crops will be hilled. Just when the time's for irrigation, they'll come up and then they'll be hilled with a piece of equipment that's hilling. You can do it old school with a hoe and it works. And then you'll be doing flood irrigation. Flood irrigation is very effective on beans. In fact, I think it's probably the best, old time, old and tried and true. Because you can, one of the reasons why I think flood irrigation is the best is because you can space your irrigation sets, your sequences, you can space them further apart. This is really important. The farther apart you can space irrigation on a crop, the stronger your root systems will be. So if you think about that, the longer you can go hydrated before you rehydrate, the stronger you are, as long as you stay hydrated. So that's the same way with the crop. If the crop can continue to tap, like in flood irrigation, you can go 10 days. Overhead irrigation, once a week. Drip irrigation, twice a week. So you see, you start looking at it. It's like, so either you're giving them sips or you're giving them big drinks, and then you let them sit. And I think traditionally big drinks are the way to go. And also, if you think about a monsoon or a big rain, that's a big drink. And you can't stop that. And we usually don't get drizzles in the summer. Either we get hammered or we don't, right? So they got to be ready for getting hammered. So the idea is you don't want to baby your crop. You want to spread your irrigation out. You want to be able to grow them on ample water, but you really want to be able to watch them until they get another sip. Overwatering is probably one of the worst things you could do to legumes in general, because they are tap rooting and they're nitrogen fixing, and they don't particularly want to be waterlogged, not these species. So that's the irrigation wrap. I would say the most, the cool season beans really respond to inoculant, which is a mycorrhizal inoculants. Peas, favas, lentils, garbanzos, they're enhanced. The growth is enhanced, their nitrogen is enhanced, their nodule production is enhanced greatly by inoculation. It's a really easy process by just literally taking a powder inoculant by the teaspoon to a fairly, like a couple of pounds easily. A teaspoon will do probably 5 pounds. All you have to do is moisten in the bucket, just a dribble of water. I mean, just a dribble, enough just to moisten the outside of those seeds. You drop that inoculant powder in. It's very fine black powder. Mix it, and it'll roll right out of a seeder. If you get it too wet, then you're in trouble, because it won't come out of a seeder. But I really recommend inoculation for those cool season legumes. We usually don't do it on the warm season ones, and it's probably to my detriment, honestly. I just don't do it, but I should, potentially. I just know that those cool season ones work really well. One of the things I really wanted to address about dry beans and our excitement about them, because they're so beautiful. And, it's almost like growing jewels, right? I want that one because it's so pretty, right? Well, one thing we have to really consider with pretty beans, because they're all beautiful, but size ratio is very, very important. if you really look at it, around here, the best bean production is a small bean, not a large fat bean. We don't grow good lima beans. They will not make. Even the Anasazi bean, which is quite a larger bean, they don't fill out quite properly. They're subject to rot, and we want them to dry solid, right? We want beans to fill out in the pod and dry solid. So it turns out black beans were very popular here for that reason. They're not a large bean. They're all protein. They're probably our best bean really for eating. You know, see, think about sustainability before just eye-popping beauty. There's a lot of big, round, cranberry-style look beans, big, fat, red beans that are twice the size of any other bean. Oh, I want to plant that. Or a big white bean that's a cannellini bean. Not going to do it unless you have a dry south hillside and you're into a horticultural project, which I don't discourage. I just don't think you should consider it being a commercially viable thing to do. And I think it's really good to work with crops that are earlier in maturity, a little, I would sacrifice size in the bean slightly for all the dependability and all the great attributes that they give for us. So that's something to really consider when you get into bean growing is size. And we have several varieties. MASA carries varieties. We've been passing it around. Some of the people that are sitting in the room right now have grown some of them. Some of the people sitting in on this right now have helped us harvest some of them. And they're now growing them because your names are all over the place. I see your face and it's wonderful. So you guys and girls all, you all know which ones you really like when it comes down the pipe. I wanted to talk about real quick, 6:35.
You got about 3 minutes left, Rich.
All right, I want to wrap it up to say, stay away. One of the things that we're really interested in is some of the more subtropical, tropical beans. Generally, what happens in this area with subtropical beans, such as cowpeas, soybeans, and lima beans, those would be three right off the top. Generally not seed crop beans here. Dry beans here. We can grow them for seed. You can work on it as a life's work and we can start to develop some earlier maturing. Be careful with those beans. Those are generally used now as foliage producing beans. Cowpeas are used in cover crops. Very effective in the summertime. Generally don't make it to a good seed crop. So I would start in the middle with small beans, Phaseolus vulgaris varieties. You could take a look at MASA. You could take a look at some of the other Colorado seed companies that are providing ones that are tried and true. Look at the history of the ones that have been making it here and start there. And so, yeah, we can ask questions later. That's all the time I have. So thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Rich. That was very jam-packed, full of information.
Going slower.
So
yeah, you're welcome. Yeah.
Yeah, if folks can just kind of save their questions until the end, we'll have we'll have some time at the end. So we'll move on to our next speakers now. They are Dan Hobbs and Nanna Meyer, and they're part of Hobbs and Meyer Farms. And Dan has 30 years of agricultural and rural development experience in the United States and South America, and currently serves as director of the Rocky Mountain Farmers Union Cooperative Development Center. He is a fifth-generation Coloradan, holds a BA in Latin American Studies, and grows organic heritage grains, varietal garlic, open pollinated seeds, and fresh produce on 40 irrigated acres in southern Colorado. Nanna Meyer is an associate professor in the Department of Human Physiology and Nutrition. She co-founded UCCS Grain School in 2016 after the university transitioned its food service to self-operation and opened its doors to transdisciplinary food systems work. She teaches grain school and various courses in sports, exercise, and wellness nutrition with focus on sustainability. In collaboration with her husband, Dan Hobbs, She works with various heritage grain varieties, including heirloom corn, and develops whole grain recipes and value-added products. I'll turn it over to you guys.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks. It's just a pleasure to be here, and I will share my screen. We put together some slides. Okay. Hopefully this is gonna work. All right. Can you see this?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, thanks. I don't like to talk to screens either, and I have done my share this year. And so I'm going to take the lead, but I am a dietitian, and you know, we often say the dietitian meets the farmer, and things are complete because you go from field to kitchen and then into, you know, your body, and so you have a very good blend of understanding of food systems. And so since 2016, you know, my focus has been more on grains, and I did recognize many, or at least a few of you in the audience being grain school students. So thanks for being in grain school online this year. But for 5 to 6 years, I've had some experiences now in heritage grains, and so I'm going to share with you my knowledge and certainly bring in Dan on the farmer side so that all of you can learn what you want to learn in this. We've trialed actually many varieties of heritage grains and ancient grains, mostly wheats, some rye, and then barleys. And I'll take more of an overview of grains and how they, you know, fit into your system and how a small scale farm would work with these grains. And then look a little bit at the larger scale as well. As we know, you know, wheat production is pretty big in America. It's mostly durum and bread wheats. You can look at Colorado here. We're pretty famous for the hard red winter wheats and then the hard white wheats as well. The truth is that, you know, obviously wheat production is all over the US, but what has been noticeable are these incredible, you know, centers of aliveness, I guess, for this heritage grain movement. And one of them is certainly started, I think, in Colorado, and there are many players, and I think we have more and more, you know, the areas of the Front Range, but also on the southwestern side of the state. We also have grain movements in Pennsylvania. We have grain movements in New York State, in Maine with the Maine Grain Alliance, and in the center actually as well with the Artisan Grain Collective, and then the Bread Lab on the western side in Washington, and grains, the Cascadian Grains group, as well as in California, multiple groups. So there is a heritage or an alternative grain value chain forming, despite the fact that there's not much to see here in, you know, Western Colorado, or even Central Colorado. There's grain being grown and heritage grains as well. So when we think about grains, they are organized in different ways, and I'm just showing you the classification by the grass family or the Poaceae family, and you can see the cereals and pseudo-cereals, how they're classified here. The ones that are underlined are also gluten-free grains, and oftentimes, you know, people kind of classify them regarding gluten content. We also refer to the rye, barley, wheat, oats, and rice to small grains. And then corn would be a, you know, larger grain, but they're still part of the grass family, and so are millet, teff, fonio, and sorghum. And they are certainly, when we think about drought tolerance, they certainly all fit the bill, and some of them are a little bit better than others. And then when we think about the winter grains first, you know, those are grains that need some level of vernalization, which is basically that period of cold during a specific stage of the plant cycle, so that it can move to the next stage. And so these winter grains are very attractive in Colorado for many different reasons. They are a great cover crop. They fit well into rotations after the fall harvest. And then obviously they are, they're just a wonderful inclusion into a farm system when you think about it. Rye is quite well known in this as a cover crop, but in the United States, rye is oftentimes moved into the weed category and is just plowed under. Where I come from the Swiss Alps, we use rye a lot as a food and a grain for bread baking. Rye is also interesting in terms of its allelopathy. And then these, cover crops, obviously they can be a lot of things. They can be feed, they can be forage, they can be seed, and then they can obviously be food. And I think from the beginning of grain school, I understood that for small farms, the diversification is critical. And so when you look at the area here, the 2 different fields, these are just trial fields that you can see in May, and then the rye planting in the fall, after the first or the last irrigation basically of the season, in sometime in October, November, depending on when that is. And then one of the unique ones that used to be grown across the Front Range is Turkey Red. It's still being grown in Kansas and it's returning, and that's a typical winter red wheat, hard red wheat. And so if you want some more information, there's quite a good website here on Turkey Red. This is just one of the examples. We trialed Turkey Red and it did really well, but we acknowledged the fact that Turkey Red is grown in Kansas, and it was actually continuously grown since the 1850s when the Mennonites brought the seed over, and so it's nice to keep supporting those Turkey Red growers there. Rye crosses, and so if you have a rye variety that you like to trial a bunch of different ryes, although depending on the expressions, it seems to be that you can maintain some diversity even if they grow side by side. But I brought over some of our own Swiss Vallis rye, and so I wanted to make sure that we were able to maintain that line. And that's a very old variety from the Swiss Alps. Rye is just really beautiful. Many farmers in the US still call it a weed. We had some rye experts from Finland, grain school, and from Washington State, actually a woman from Lithuania who gave a nice talk, which is available on our Swell UCCS website that I can give you later, on rye in the United States and how rye really is a culinary gold medal, and it's also a nutritional gold medal. By the way, when these grains dry down, obviously this is the time to harvest. This is a typical Triticomastivum, a bread wheat. It is an older variety, but you can see the typical expression of bread wheat here. And then einkorn, emmer, and spelt, you've probably heard a lot about. These are Halt grains. These are very old wheats. The first wheats ever, einkorn and emmer, appeared in around 12,000. First cultivated that time, 12,000 years ago. Spelt, moved through the Fertile Crescent, and it appears that another bread wheat was already free threshing, and spelt moved into Europe from the Fertile Crescent at about 7,000 BC. So these are really interesting. They are hulled, and so when they are still hulled, it means that they're still quite ancient. There are the unhulled einkorn, emmer, and spelt. You can get them, but they then are no longer these ancient types. So the hulling process will be explained in a second. And then when we go to spring wheats and spring grains in general, barleys and oats, and as well as the different durums, you can see them here. These don't require vernalization, and there's certainly a chance here with climate change to move them into winter wheats. And I think all of you probably know that we like winter plantings, and I understand this now too, because when you plant spring trials, and the weed pressure is just extremely heavy, and it almost breaks your back. So when you look at these, we've trialed some of these in the field, the bronze barley, This is a chet barley. And then you have different durums. Khorasan or Kamut is a durum. And these are also considered ancient, very old. And then the durums, there's quite a diversity, and the research in durum is incredible. And it's probably the wheat that still has the most significant diversity available. And some of it comes straight out of Ethiopia. Emmer is the first, is kind of the mother grain of durum. So these are also higher in protein, especially for the wheats that are grown in the springtime. And their harvest is about at the same time, but they are fast growing. This is one of the Kubanka. This is Kubanka actually in its flowering stage. You know that wheats can be grown side by side. They don't cross so easily. And so it makes it a little bit easier for trials. These are just a few depiction of barleys, a 2-row barley and then a 6-row barley. These are, of course, there's a pretty tremendous yield difference between 2-row and 6-row barleys, but all of these have done really well along with the durums in our region. And then we have the facultative grains, and these are thought to do, they don't have a clock basically, and who knows whether the grains really have a clock. The vernalization is real, but climate change is also real, and we'll probably see more and more of this transitioning where you can grow a winter crop in the springtime, or vice versa, spring crop in the winter time, planting it in the fall. This particular one, the Bluebeard durum, we planted in the fall, and it's survived multiple cold winters. So it is possible, but we are in Pueblo County, a little bit more south. In terms of varietal selection, this is a great question. I would probably say when we go through this list here, what should you grow? It's oftentimes the access to the seed that's your stopping block. Seeds are not readily available for the heritage grains, and that might change with time. Projects are moving towards more of the seed increase. So access to seed is a real issue. I listed a few things, including the USDA seed library where you can get seed. Most of these have very small, limited amount of seeds, handful, like everyone starts that way. But grain is great because you can upgrade fairly quickly.
Can I jump in there for a second?
Yeah.
So everybody, Fort Collins has the biggest collection of these grass grain seeds in the world, I think. They do a lot of the grow-outs in Idaho, in Aberdeen, Idaho, and they store the germplasm in Fort Collins in a cryo-freeze situation, but they send it up to Idaho to grow out. And so if you're ever interested in looking at some of these diverse, interesting, rare wheats, rye, barleys, you can request packet quantities from Idaho. They like you to have some kind of bona fide scientific project or trial, but they're pretty liberal with the donations. So I wouldn't hesitate to contact them. And on that note, I think we've got 6 or so other germplasm banks. I know, for example, the pepper collection, because we grow a lot of peppers around here, is located in Georgia. And so there's different specializations to all these seed banks, and just an amazing inventory of material if you want to look at some new stuff.
Yeah, and there's certainly also seed banks around the world. Particularly interesting is the fact that, that many of these grains come from Israel, and they come from a variety of very arid regions. And so there are some smaller seed banks, and oftentimes, so the USDA germplasm has most of the collections. So it's a good place to start here. For me, I'm in nutrition, so I always ask, well, what's the primary use? Because you could use grains just like in the first picture on the right as a cover crop in an orchard. You can see white Sonora and wheat coming up here amongst many other perennials in an orchard. Or you have a big field where you really want to get going. If you're starting with a handful, it's going to take about 3 to 5 years to increase that seed so that you have enough. This is a rye field. Or maybe you're interested in putting these different grains into your vegetable rotations. And you can see the black barley here in about 1,000 row feet setup. So the primary use is important if you want to have it for culinary purposes. It should be, obviously for that reason in an area where you can easily harvest it either by hand or you're going to harvest it by combine if it's a larger area. And then, as mentioned by Richard already, the water concentrations are important. What kind of watering system do you have? We do flood irrigation, and I think Dan can jump in here anytime. I'll talk a little bit more about water, and these grains are very drought tolerant, so the watering is not substantial, but if there is drought stress, you will see it. And then small grains function in various farming systems, and I'll ask Dan for a little bit of input here to think about, your farming system as a whole.
Yeah, this is interesting. The grain has always been a foundational part of our farm. Like Rich, I was farming in northern New Mexico in the 1990s and was part of a thing called the Northern New Mexico Wheat Project. And I first learned about grains down there. We trialed a bunch of interesting grains. I kept a hold of one in particular that I really liked. And until I met my dietitian partner, I actually never milled it or ate it. I just used it in the farm system. And it fits such an interesting, we were really a 40-acre flood irrigated farm set up kind of on a rotational basis. And we planted the Austrian winter peas and a winter white wheat together every year. And it was just such an interesting crop to have on the farm for many reasons, for grazing, for harvesting straw, for harvesting seed, and for managing our irrigation. And, when we're in these deficit irrigation positions, like a lot of us are in Colorado and New Mexico and the arid West in general, having crops that require less water is really important. And so particularly the winter grains, we always planted these Austrian peas and these wheats in the fall. They kept the ground covered. We would lightly graze them with the neighbor's cows, deposit some manure, then let them grow out, water them, maybe flood irrigate them maybe just 1 or 2 times. And so the water was conserved for our specialty crops, which in our case were the garlic and Pueblo chili and some other specialty vegetables. And so we could put that precious resource on the specialty crops, on the cash crops, and kind of deprive the grains and the peas a little bit of water, and they like it. And actually they're higher quality generally if they're not overwatered. We saw the protein rates would be higher on these wheat varieties when they were watered less. And so it became a really important water management practice for us to plant these grains. But also the straw. We've sold a lot of straw over the years. After we harvest the grain, we cut that straw and it goes into the building markets. It goes to people's animal yards. It's used as mulch. It's just a really nice commodity to have around the farm. So finally, 20 years after planting this particular hard white winter wheat, with Nanna's influence, we got it into testing, and it turned out it was about a 12% wheat, really favorable for bread baking. And it turns out the pizza guys love it. It turns out it's a great tortilla wheat. It's just this very versatile crop. So it was this kind of sleeper. It was playing this sort of, ecological role on our farm, which of course it still does, but it turns out it's got all these great culinary applications. So that's the period, by the way, sort of era we're in with our farm now, is we're trying to take all these grains into market, and it's taken a while to increase them to the point where we have enough to work with, but we're there now. All right, we better keep moving.
Okay, yeah, sounds good. So just a few, locations here for larger scale grain seed if you're interested. And then what I heard before from Rich, there's a good Boulder community with Mad Ag and MASA to increase some of these seeds so that you can actually access them, because that's still the biggest limiting factor. And then, a few other comments here for the climate in varietal selection. I think for us, it was always clear that winter plantings were most preferred because you could outcompete the weeds. You can see the spring planted barley on the side here. When these grains are drilled in with a heavy seeding rate, they do pretty well, especially in the fast growing spring barley. That outsprinted the fall planted einkorn actually. The einkorn is a very slow growing of the ancient wheats. It's the slowest, the lowest yield. It has about 50% of the yield of any other wheat. So it's a very difficult one to grow, but it is just the most nutritious of all. Because it is so slow in our region, it has some pressures, particularly during the monsoons that happen sometime, coming in July. This just shows the field with beheaded einkorn, right? They're still brittle. Their heads are brittle, and when a hailstorm comes through, most of the spelt einkorn emmer are not going to survive. They will just break off. You have to pick them from the ground. And then the other thing is wind. You can see the lodging. Some of these heritage grains are very tall. If you have really good soil and you water a lot, they will grow extremely tall and they will lodge. And so it's really more important to kind of keep them drought tolerant and put them where the soil is less nutritious.
Yeah, and just to quickly add there, this is really important because like some of these varieties will be, 6 feet tall. And, so to not overwater them and not over fertilize them, like we follow our garlic crops with the grains. So the garlic get fertilized and then the grains come through and kind of take up the residual.
Mm-hmm. Watering, is obviously important when you're thinking about the fall. If your water cycle turns off, in the middle of September, your grain will have to go in before that because you still need a watering to make them germinate, especially in the dry falls. And so they need moisture, but then once they're in, they really don't need more than 2 to 3 watering cycles. The most water they need in the boot, obviously right for germination and boot flowering and fill-in stage. Dry land, obviously, you saw that on the map, right? In northeastern and southeastern Colorado, most of the grain is produced dry land. And so it's important that we understand that they are drought tolerant grains in general, whether they're heritage or not. And then we've mentioned this with the fertilizer input. They really don't need a lot. They are, particularly when you think about rye, emmer, and other heritage grains, they like to thrive in poor soil. So it's a great way to build your soil nutrient content. Seeding considerations here, obviously a drill is great and it seeds so densely and it outcompetes the weeds. I understand this now because for 5 years I've been working with trials and it is hard work when you have 1,000-foot rows. If you have your little garden plot, that's one thing, but oh my gosh. So seeding rates, I've turned my opinion. Initially, we came with 20 seeds and mentioned to the farmers, put these in every 6, inches, forget it. Because when you do that, they are going to get so weedy that you're spending too much time. Broadcasting is not only fun, it is very effective, but I'll show you some of the drawbacks. And then the option with a seeder is good too. And in a 30-foot bed, you could actually do 2 rows of grain. You can see here in the fall, this is fall planting with the drill, watering right after, and then, just a few weeks after, you see them germinate. So that's what you want. We shouldn't forget when you think about the seeding rate, the tillering of these plants. So there is some problem when your seeding rate is too high. They get outcrowded, and they are a little higher for disease pressures when that happens. So just thinking about the tillers, and you can see them a little bit better here. This is actually that wheat that Dan talked about on the left side. But all of them are different. They have different tillers, more ancient, more tillers, and they are prolific. Einkorn particularly is interesting because it's slow growing and has very deep roots. So it's good for the soil too. So just an example here, seeded either by the seeder in the middle or by hand. You can see the weed pressure in the furrows. And this is in May. You can imagine how this looks in June. It's like a jungle to get through, at least in flood irrigation. Drill planted red 5 is out competing the weeds. And then broadcasted, you can see these spots there. They don't look very brutal right now, but one more month with flood irrigation and they are taller than me. So it's a jungle. So it's quite important to think about that. And then harvesting, a lot of the trials are hand harvested, and so they use a sickle. It's a very nice activity to do with groups, and then bundle them and have a safe place to hang them. The bird pressure when you're hanging them outside or even in an open shed or mouse rodent pressure is real. So what we've done in the later stages of trials is just cutting their heads and then putting them into bags. And then you have them in these white bags, and the next thing is you have to thresh them. And they can be threshed with various sticks. I like to dance on them, and I'm going to try to show you this, if it works. Yep. So this became, I'm a former ski racer, so this became my activity. Anything I do on the farm is really my physical activity and shape. So you can have them in a bin, and then you remove the stalks, and slowly you get them to the seed, and in the end you work with a fan and winnow, and then some seed screens to get these done. Okay, and then on a larger scale, there's certainly the need for a combine. Here we have one of those John Deere's, 1970 something. Right?
I think that was 68.
Oh, 68. Okay, 1968. And then we have an even older or almost as old grain truck with a bin on top. And so when it goes through the field, it gets combined into that bin. And these bins have been really helpful for us on that scale. They hold about
2,200 pounds.
Yeah, so it's good for at least an acre. And then they get stored, and the next thing, either if a farm has a seed cleaner right for the field, it can go from the combine directly into the seed cleaner to get most of the chaff and small items out, and then the seed cleaning goes on with a clipper or something similar, a thresher, for example, that I've been working with. And then just a little bit more, this is about the rye on the left side. You can see the rye when it's dried down, it kind of bends down. So that's your indication to get it out. And then it has a lot of still cleaning that needs to be done. We have a crippen, so we have different screens here that we get it to a pretty nice place, but then it still needs to go into a destoner. And this is critical, especially if it goes to market. As I've mentioned, the Halt Grains, they have to go through a dehuller, and typically, a system might be connected to a destoner then as well. And that's, a little bit more pricey. We have a spelt grower in Dolores, out there in the Southwest Colorado, Tyler Wilbanks, who has his own dehuller. So they can be manufactured, they can be engineered if you're versed in that area. They're different dehullers. And then what we've been using is either on the small scale, the white bags first, and then once they are food grade, I like the Grain Pro bags. They do seal the moisture out. It's really critical to make sure that moisture content is below 14%. And in Colorado, that's not such a big deal. Most of our grain is pretty dry. On the larger scale, you can store them in these sacks. And then I like to move them into the smaller grain bins before you move them into, a food environment with those screw top lids. So there's obviously a lot more to say about storage, especially considering safety and the quality of the grain. There is some insect pressure that we shouldn't forget. Summer grains, just briefly, I think we're going to focus a little bit more on the ones like corn. And I know some of you had some questions on buckwheat and then our experience with amaranth and sorghum. These are summer crops, right? They get planted in May. Some of the corn, suited for Colorado should not extend beyond 90 to 100 days because it wouldn't be able to finish. We've experienced some of this. We've had some success with Chapalote, but it's difficult. These are still wild varieties and they take about 120 days to finish. You can see in this picture, there's amaranth here. It's a nice way to indicate when you have different trials going. You can see and spot the amaranth right in between, and they make a nice companion. I've worked a lot now with corn and corn trials. Obviously, these cross-pollinate, and you can see in this picture, the Concho and Rio Grande were next to each other, and so you have that phenotypical expression. That shouldn't have a large impact on, the quality of the grain itself. My interest here is to test them for nutritional composition, and that shouldn't impact it, but you wouldn't be able to use this for seed, right, when you do these trials. Sometimes when you live in an area where we live, where there's a lot of corn for feed, especially the yellow dent corn, we put our seed varieties into a tunnel, and that's possible. Some of this challenge here is when you have these older varieties, they grow extremely tall in a tunnel, and when you water them, they can lodge. So it's a difficult endeavor. And then of course we stress the importance of companion planting here for the corn. There are different types of corn, and again, it's your choice. What do you want to do with your corn? What's the purpose of the corn? When you look at these, they're typical flour corns. They are great for flour and bread baking, also for tortilla making. These are wonderful corns. These are the typical Southwestern corn varieties. When you go into more of the flint corns, they are harder in nature. They're better for polenta and those types of products than a typical tortilla. And then obviously there's also the popcorn varieties if you are interested in popping corn. The Oaxacan green is really not grown in Oaxaca. This was just a hybrid with the yellow dent and the blue corn. It is a beautiful corn and it finishes very fast. So that's an interesting one. And here you can see a contra corn field, very tall. They dry down sometime for us in November, sometimes, and we leave them as long as possible to fully dry down. One of the difficulty in corn is to make sure that it is fully dried down. You shell it, you take the husk off right away because in the husk it will mold. And then you have problems with toxins. That's a real issue. On the small scale, and I can't remember how they are called in Mexico, but on the small scale, you can use your dried corn and you can strip them together, and this end is very, very hard, and that's how you can shell your corn naturally with the resources of your own farm. We have a corn sheller from the turn of the century, almost 100 years old, and so we shell the corn this way. Once it comes out of the sheller, it's pretty clean, but it's good to put it on a screen and then to winnow it to get the rest out, but that is food grade ready. Luckily in Colorado, we don't have a lot of the issues with vomitoxins and some of the mycotoxins on corn, but they can be in your corn if they mold. We've grown this variety of sorghum. This is the black amber cane sorghum. It's a beautiful plant. Sorghum is interesting. It can be used for syrup, but the grain is underutilized, absolutely underutilized, gluten-free. Wonderful grain for a variety of uses, especially if you cook it. Some of it pops. So sorghum, is the most drought hardy of all of the grains. And some suggest you can actually plant it a little deeper, especially in environments where it's extremely dry. We had wonderful experiences with amaranth. It's just a beautiful plant and it grows prolifically. It shatters quickly. It's very small, tiny seed, difficult to clean, but even if you don't get it fully clean for a home scale or, for a market scale, this is just extra fiber that comes along with your seed to eat. You can make drinks from it. It's just a wonderfully nutritious grain. teff, so far I don't know anyone in Colorado growing teff. We tried last year and the weeds took it over. I assume if you keep it clean, it can be a great trial. There's, I think, an Idaho grower who grows teff, and the website, I believe, is this one. Quinoa, San Luis Valley. This is a great crop for colder environments, and certainly the San Luis Valley is the lead here. We're lucky that we have quinoa in our state, I think. And with amaranth and quinoa, you can use the entire plant for a variety of different things, including food and also dyes. And then buckwheat, we have a little bit of experience with buckwheat, but I'll let Dan talk about buckwheat more. I wish that there were more, buckwheat in food coming out of Colorado. It's just an incredible grain for its nutrition. It is hulled, and so the hull is high fiber, but if you have a mill, you can leave the mill at a cracked open space and get the hull off and sift it out. That hull is almost indigestible. It's very high in fiber. But I'll let Dan talk to buckwheat for a moment.
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add actually here, other than, this was always, agronomically speaking, an emergency crop. It's so fast growing and it's heat tolerant. If you had a June hailstorm, you could still put buckwheat in July and probably get a crop off of it. So it's one of these sort of super plants. It's got all these different applications on the farm. You see there, it's a great pollinator plant. It mobilizes phosphorus. As many of you probably know, we may have phosphorus in our soils, but it's immobile. It's locked up and not available. I'll tell you, the best garlic crop I ever had in my 26 years of growing garlic was following a buckwheat crop. And then of course, it is nutritious and delightful to eat. Definitely a heat-loving plant. It loves it down here in Pueblo, and I've planted it with cowpeas, thinking that those two would be a really interesting companion. But the cowpeas are generally much longer maturing, and the buckwheat is so fast that it just went to seed like a rocket.
Yeah, great. There are so many different varieties of buckwheat, and the Bread Lab is probably the good source for more information on it. And then just for the summer crops, the same access to seeds. We see quite a renaissance of heirloom corn interest also coming from restaurants. So there's an opportunity here for heirloom corn. Currently, the access to seeds is the same thing. And corn is not so easy as wheat, barley, because it cross-pollinates. So it's very difficult to keep the seed viable and isolated. Corn also needs to be, finishing, right, to have a viable seed. Primary use, think about the different corn varieties and what you're interested. I know Aspen Moon grows this Floriani red corn, which is wonderful for polenta, but not so great for tortillas. And then also the water considerations, again, with flood irrigation versus something else. Certainly, corn in the heat requires more water than a wheat or a rye finishing up in the summertime, right? These are going through the entire season. And then, they fit into various farming rotations. So
yeah, and I would even extend it to gardens. I think all these legumes and grains that we're talking about today, got commodified and they got sort of taken away from the people over the last 50 years, but they can be grown on any scale. You might not be producing, sacks of wheat off of your home garden, but there's a role for these grains and these legumes to play on a garden scale too, even, mini rotations or, just ecological considerations. And so I would just, encourage everybody to feel empowered to try stuff at whatever scale. And when our combine, for example, was broke down last year, we had about an acre of this wonderful Austrian wheat sitting out there. And we decided, well, we're not going to wait around anymore. We're going to start harvesting it by hand. So we went out there with the sickles and made quick work of it, and and brought in a lot of grain. So if you're curious about these things, I would say try it. Whatever scale.
Mm-hmm. And they're just really beautiful. And it's, also a point that beauty is one consideration. It's not everything, because sometimes the yields just don't stack up. So your trials are going to be most important. issues with grains, this is the last slide that we have. Contamination is certainly, I'm totally excited about these grains, and I couldn't grow more. There's always one more variety that I'd like to try out. But the end result on your farm is a problem, particularly with rye. Rye goes everywhere. It's a good thing if you want to grow rye. And certainly there is a shortage of real good culinary rye. So equipment failures, as mentioned, you can divert quickly manpower, and woman power, you can bring sickles in and get it done. In the summer, we do have the storms coming, and it's just, we are lucky, I think, in Colorado and the Southwest. In Europe, I know the farmers where I'm from, they are just praying that they can get their crop in. And the ability to finish is just, it's a difficult time. Infrastructure needs are very tricky, particularly when you think about harvesting, acreage without a combine, and the combine alone is not everything. You need to have the seed cleaning, and I think there's a lot of that happening now, that grain gets on the market and it's not really clean, and something can happen that a stone is a remnant in both the beans and the grains, and it's just a really tricky thing. So we need to figure out this infrastructure piece, either cooperatively or for larger farms to transition to some of these heritage grains or new crops. Storage, and infestations, I cannot stress this enough. You have to have a plan how to store the grain and how to move it, how to package. There's just a massive amount of infestation that can happen, and that can just eradicate everything. Food safety and grain quality is something that we stress with Grain School, and we'll have a little bit more information coming forward with some pamphlets in the grain space in the future. And then figure out your markets. I think, with Grain School, we have built a market. There is a market, and so we just recently received the USDA grant to expand those markets, and so we invite young farmers like you to come on board, and I think that's really where the Colorado Grain Chain comes in. We'd like to invite you to join this organization as a small farmer, or small scale farmer, large scale farmer, any scale, and start to collaborate. If you do join, you're also going to get a nice grain literacy guide that will have a lot of the information and more from what we talked about today. And I think the ultimate goal here is that we grow and share our strengths and help each other out where there are weaknesses, so that we can be successful and we have a grain economy that is an alternative and really delicious grain economy that survives. These projects are bound for real difficult, competition, non-collaboration, out-competing. So it's really important to do it wisely and smartly. And I think our USDA grant will help us to bring people on board and provide you with the training that you might want in this grain space through Grain School. And hopefully the Colorado Grain Chain can help you with an onboarding and feeling that you are supported in diversification of your own farm. And UCCS Grain School is really here for education. So we're open now for questions. I don't know if you want to talk about Farmers Union briefly or anything in that grain space.
No, probably not. You might want to just mention Grain School in the Field this fall.
Yeah, this fall in November, the 13th, 14th, and 15th of November, we have Grain School in the Field in Pueblo County. And this is with the Pueblo Food Project together for their food summit. And we'll have a grain only track. And then on the last day of this Grain School in the Field, we're going to be in the field looking at trials and working in what we are building here, a small tortilleria in our food hub. And so hopefully by then we have all the equipment in there and can share our experiences and teach about corn. It's all about corn this year. All right.
Thanks, Dan and Nanna. That was great. I did have Kip had a question for Rich. He was wondering if there are specific Colorado seed companies that you recommend for legumes.
Oh, you.
Oh, yeah, I know one called MASA Seed Foundation. They're pretty good. Sorry. Not sorry, actually. We have a lot of good seeds, and that's the ones that we work with. Small scale wise, I don't actually have a lot offhand for legumes and dry beans that are far more diverse than what we're carrying right now. So Kip, you know where we are, so why don't you come and visit us, and we'll get you some more. You already have, actually. So I don't know. I'm not sure what some of the other growers are growing in the dry bean thing. It seems that people are sticking to mostly the commons, a lot of pintos, some blacks being grown, but I haven't ventured out to see what else is out there. If someone else knows in the group, they could participate in that answer.
Yeah, I could offer a little bit. There's a couple, and none of us that are doing these kind of small seed enterprises have a vast collection. You know, MASA probably has the biggest amongst us, but we've got a number of peas and favas, including a San Luis fava bean that's been grown in southern Colorado for 150 years. The bolita bean, which is the traditional Spanish bean, which is acclimated to elevation. A few others. So Pueblo Seed Company is us. And then there's also High Desert Seed in Montrose, Laura Parker. She's got a handful of varieties. And then Higher Ground Gardens in the Crestone area. So I think those are the four that come to my mind: MASA, Pueblo Seed, High Desert, and Higher Ground.
Does anybody else have any questions? Feel free to hop in.
No questions?
What's the protocol for stopping by MASA's farm location here in Boulder? You guys open Monday through Friday? Is there a storefront or a place that we can come in person and look at seed?
The seed's in a couple locations right now, Cody. It'll all be back at the farm on 75th Street here fairly soon. We're there every day, but usually protocol is to be getting in touch with Laura, who will take care of letting you know when's a good time to come, because we're fielding a lot of volunteers right now as well. So if we hear ahead of time, generally it's still cool. Just come. Yeah, we're there every day. We're there every day. So if you give a peep out early, you have my number. I know if you give us a warning and say, hey, usually midday's kind of decent. We're good before it gets too hot. You know, right now we're holding on with this cold, so it's all,
Yeah.
You know, the midday's pretty good. And as things warm up, we're all going to be running around like crazy. You know, so midday's good, or later, sometimes after 5 too.
Okay, I'll reach out. Thanks, Rich.
Yeah, you're welcome. It'll be good to see you. I know it's sometimes hard to get in touch. Thank you.
Amen.
Yep.
Yeah, hi, Alex up here in Fort Collins. Both y'all touched on intercropping quite a bit, and I was wondering if you could go into, I mean, Dan, you were talking about the Austrian peas and the triticale intercropping, and Rich, you were talking about lentils and some other intercropping. I know there's the Three Sisters Garden, which is kind of like the famous summer dry bean, corn, squash intercropping, but if y'all had any other summer crop, dry bean intercrops that you've been playing around with.
We're still getting back into it, Alex. So, you know, it encourages me to try. I don't think we have, you know, right now, since we're so low on pole beans, we're really wanting to work more with some climbers and see what that can do. Still trying to get that balance in understanding the way the pole bean works with the corn, the whole thing I'm really interested in. But as far as those Phaseolas, still, those vulgaris, at present, we're still working just straight out, keeping them wide open, especially because that later part in the season where if you've got something green going on, you know you want them to dry out. And it's so crucial. But I can see if Dan, do you have any work with like bolitas? Have you worked with intercropping with bolita at all?
Yeah, we haven't much. You know, the strain of bolitas that we have are just so vigorous and viney. They just take up a lot of space. You know, the Hopi bean might be, that Hopi black bean you were talking about might be a better candidate. And what about those milpas we saw in Oaxaca? What do you remember about how they were planting those beans?
I think they were not in any organized fashion. They were they were wild.
I think the thing is that species, you know, the vulgaris is just a little bit more tends to work in the domesticated situation. Whereas when you're working with pisciums and you're working with lentils and garbanzos, they've got that wild nature. They can work intercropping a little bit different, just the way they work with the grains. And the grain they're working with is also a grain that dries out formidably, usually a grass grain like a wheat, obviously, or an oats. So, you know, those we work with, I think there's multiple experiments to still do in those, and in a way to start to combat weeds and also to do that trellising work. There's so many ways to try now. You know, we've got to work on that one still. This inner row one where we're going every other, I'm very curious to see how the lentils are going to act in with this durum. It's going to be a little fun and tricky, but hey, we got to try it. And that's the way to do it. A couple of years ago, we planted it directly with emmer, and we didn't get the ratio right. So the emmer pretty much won, and the garbanzos were a little punky in there. So I think ratio is really important. But those vulgaris, you know, corridors, when you plant corn traditionally, usually you have enough room and you can create corridors. So sometimes you can plant that 4 rows on, 3 or 4 rows off. So when you get corridors, that's one way to work with the interplanting. Direct connection, direct contact. I've just never seen those vulgaris varieties like to be with anything as they go into that maturity process, unless it's something that's finishing really early and it can sort of lay on it going dry. Because you just don't want any competition, because powdery mildew is rampant as soon as we get rains. So that's still so the experiment's up to you too, bud, on that one. Yeah,
Well,
I'm
thank
not quite, still not sure.
you. Okay.
Okay, what else?
We got a question there about wheat lacoche. Yeah, gosh, we had an amazing crop of wheat lacoche here this summer, and actually in almost all of our varieties, no?
Yeah, almost all. We had 12 varieties, and they were mostly land races. And yeah, you could see it in the wilder, I guess, in Chapalote, and we also planted a Mexican maize ajo, which is more like a pod corn. No, it's just amazing.
Maybe you better say what wheat lacoche is.
No, I think most people
No,
understand.
okay.
Yeah, corn smut right in our territory. Nobody wants it, but it's just delicious.
It's a
and
delicacy.
Yeah, and it can be used as a dye too, and it's just it's wild. Yeah. Beautiful.
Yeah, it shows up, it really shows up on the Oaxacan green pretty well. It does a nice job all over it. It's fun.
Yeah, and that Oaxacan green is just really beautiful.
Isn't it though?
Yeah.
That's very interesting that it really wasn't originally a Oaxacan strain. Who bred Oaxacan green?
I'm not sure who it was, but somebody in the Midwest.
There was a Midwest breed that happened in the late 80s. Probably wasn't that old, was it then?
No, I don't think so. No.
I think we got a hold of some of the earliest seed in the early 90s, and I was in southern New Mexico, and I was dead sure we got it from Oaxaca. So that's very nice to know that it's an American breed. It's a North American breed. It's a great cross,
Yeah,
really great cross.
yeah.
One of the things I wanted to ask about grains was that, you know, we grow tortilla corn, and it is really quite, there's a fine line between the corns when they work good for tortillas. A lot of good cornmeal corns, but tortilla corn is very specific.
Mm.
And one of the things that I want to do a trial of, and I haven't yet, is to look for some of the Pueblo whites and some of the, what I would call pozole corns, the white pozole corns, which tend to have more of a hard starch. And looking for that to work into our white corn, because we don't really have good white corn production up here at all. So we're still counting on we're literally counting on an organic Southern hybrid still to get white corn for tortillas.
We should bring you some of our concho to trial.
Well, we'd like to try it. You know, it's really, you are almost in a different state in Pueblo, believe it or not.
That's
It's
true.
true. It's
And, you know,
very different.
I guess I didn't show that, but, you know, you have your flint corn, like a Floriani red,
Yeah,
and then, you know, a flour corn, but the concho is slightly flinty,
right.
just slightly.
Whereas a corn like the corn we grow with the Tarahumara blue corn that we took up, you know, it's taken a long travel all the way from southern New Mexico, from a border to Gila, all the way up to Colorado. And now it finishes, and it's a dual purpose corn, tremendous dual purpose corn, but it still won't compare, you know, to a hybrid blue by any chance, but it's a fantastic dual purpose corn. And it's now pretty much all finishes. We still haven't run a combine through it yet. So we're still trying to work on early drops, early maturation, all that kind of stuff, you know. And the Oaxacan green, the largest crop we had was 5 acres, and it did produce a clean 10,000 pounds. So that was nice. And the farmer said he wouldn't do it again because it wasn't enough. And I was like, it made me sad because it was wonderful to have that much corn, you know, it was just so beautiful.
Mhm.
What do you think is a good amount of corn for smaller scale growers to be financially viable when it comes to these, I don't know, your blues and your tortilla corn?
Well, I think, you know, financial viability, well, I'm jumping in. These guys can talk about that as well. You know, you're always on any scale under large scale industrial, you're always falling into a specialty market. So either you're value adding it, Cody, or you're growing it for seed, which honestly, as MASA increases and some of the rest of us in our small scale seed endeavors increase the demand, the seed's worth far more than the food ever will be. So the day I give you a call to say, hey, we need 100 pounds of a specific corn, now you got a small plot. In fact, I have about a half a dozen corns right now. And if you've got a plot, there's some beautiful corns we have right now. I'd love to see 100 pounds for it, you know? So I think looking at it from seed preservation, and then we work from seed preservation into multi-use, we start getting into the cooperative headspace again. Because, you know, we're talking about a commodity crop. When we get into the economics of the thing, it's, for us small scale growers, seed's the most valuable. I just got to say that. Yeah. And seed in your own eating needs. You know what I'm saying?
Absolutely. Well, you haven't been to the new property that we're on, know what we're working with, and, you know, maybe there's a good opportunity to collaborate in some of those fields there.
Yeah. That's a good little spot. I know that property actually.
I do have another question for Dan and Nanna. Have you ever worked with the India Jamu?
Mm-mm.
No.
No,
Yes,
tell them about it.
It's a landrace wheat variety from India, in the Kush Mountains, higher elevation. I guess that'll be our experiment this year then.
Yeah.
Nice.
No.
Yeah, we're on 3rd generation. We started from about 12 seeds, and the seeds are gorgeous right now, so I'm looking forward to seeing. I think maybe we put 1,000 row feet. So we put about 5 rows, a couple 100 feet long on that, really nice, tight, dense. So we'll take a look at it and see how it goes. But
Cool.
the greens are really pretty. And the flavor, the jumbo was a really good flavor test with the Mad Ag. We had a bake off. They had a little bake off, and it was one of the tastier breads. So
Awesome.
yeah, we want to see that one come through. We're rooting for that one. Yeah. Bye.
That was it, I guess.
Just to respect everyone's time here, we are a little over, but thank you to our speakers. I learned a lot. I don't know about the rest of you. But just to put a plug in for what's going on next, or we're having, or Flatirons is also doing an animal husbandry set of classes this upcoming year. And there will be a couple more on small scale grains. Yeah, keep information will be available on our website. Sign up for our newsletter. And also we have a Facebook group and Instagram. And just wanted to shout out and thank everyone that attended, and especially our speakers. It was great. Yeah, thanks for coming, everybody.
Yeah.
We'll be in touch.
Yeah,
Have a
Hey,
good spring.
thank you all.
yeah. Thank
Thank you, speakers.
Thank you.
And you're welcome. You're welcome. And look at that snow. It's still coming. Unbelievable. Happy grains in the field. Happy
Right.
peas. The best peas this year. Here we
Happy
go.
peas.
Happy peas. Peace on earth. Take care.
Peas on earth. Yeah. Thanks, everyone. Oh, sweet.
Awesome.
Nanna and Dan and Rich, I'll be in touch with you guys later.
Oh, okay, good. I just jumped back in. Okay. We'll see you.
Thanks, Rich. Appreciate it.
Okay, you too. I hope we did okay. I had a lot of fun. Thank you.
You did great.
Okay, God bless. Bye-bye. Okay. Oh, yeah. Thanks, man.